it's Stacey. I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving for those of you in the US. I know I feel very grateful, thankful and blessed that you all join me each week on my YouTube channel. So thank you everyone. Today we're going to be finishing off our Christmas tree quilt top by adding on a white border and then our checkered border. So let's get going. So I've cut 5 2-inch strips to make my first border, and I'm going to join them on the diagonal. I'm going to show you how to do that very quickly, or you could refer to my video how to make a border for your quilt where I go over it very thoroughly. But for now I'm just going to do it quickly. I've got my 2-inch strip lined up on a line on my mat. I'm going to take another piece. If this was a padded piece of fabric, the right side would be facing me, and then I'd be putting the right side facing down, lining this piece up on a line on my mat again. Then I'm just going to rule a line from this corner down to the bottom corner. Pop some pins in to keep it in place. Then we're going to sew along that line we just drew. So with my standard foot on, I'm stitching at stitch length 2, and I'm just going to stitch along the line I drew, not worrying about doing any back stitches. So now we're just going to cut off this extra fabric on the side here. So now we're just going to trim off this excess by taking my ruler, finding the 1/4 inch line mark, lining it up on the stitches and trimming. Then we'll just trim off these little excess triangles and we'll press it open, and then we'll repeat that until all of our strips are sewn together. So I've got my quilt top here and I've squared it off and I've given it a good iron and I've smoothed it out, and now I've got the middle row of my trees here, and what I'm going to do is take my border and lay it along the middle of one of my rows. So I want it to come a little bit past the edge and on the other side, and then I'm going to trim it roughly. And I do go over this quite comprehensively in my other video, how to attach a border, if you'd like to see me doing this with a bit more detail, and I'll put the link above. And then I'm going to do that again. So what we're doing is we're just making the borders for the top and the bottom right now. So we're just smoothing it across, making sure it's up the right way. We don't want it too taut, but we don't want it loose. We want it just sitting there really nicely. And then I'll trim that one again. So now I've just put my cutting mat underneath my quilt top, and I'm just going to trim the borders on the side first. I'm going to take my ruler and line it up with the edge of my quilt. Take my cutter and just cut that excess off. And then I'll do exactly the same on the other side. So now I'm on the other side and I'm just going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to line up the edge of my ruler with the edge of my quilt and just trim that excess off. Then we're going to attach it to sew. So now we'll attach the top border. What we'll do is we'll take our first piece, fold it in half, lining up the edges at the end here, and just finger pressing it so we know where our halfway mark is. And I know where the halfway mark is on my quilt because it's in the middle of 3 and 4 Christmas tree. Then I'm going to take my strip and line up the finger press that I just did with the middle of my quilt, with the wrong side of the strip down. So if you're using white like me, we know when that is because we've got our seam here where we joined our fabric diagonally. So what I'll do is I'll just pop a pin in there, making sure the edges are lined up nicely. Then I'm going to come to this end, line up the edges on both sides and the corner, pin, and then do the same on the other corner. Then while I'm here, I'll just pop in a few extra pins. Now I'm going to sew that and press, and then we'll do exactly the same for the bottom border. So now I'm just going to attach that border. I've got my 1/4 inch foot on. I'm going to stitch at stitch length 2, and I'm not going to worry about a back stitch. And then I'm just going to do exactly the same for the bottom border. So once I finish sewing on the border, I set the seams and press the seams up away from the Christmas trees at the top and the bottom. And now I'm just going to repeat that exact same process for the 2 side borders. So now we're going to make our second border, which was the little squares, and I'm using 5 fabrics. I did use 6 fabrics for the Christmas trees, but I want to use the red for my binding, so I've just decided to use the 5 that I used for the trees. And my fabric is directional, which means sometimes around the border it's going to be facing the wrong way, but I'm not worried about that as long as I make sure the fabrics are all facing the right way when I sew them together. I think that will look like part of the design. But if that upsets you or you don't like that, you could make 2 lots of these borders. So you've got one with the fabric running to the side like this for when we do the side borders, and then you could do it again with the directional fabric running down for when you're doing the top and the bottom. But for now, I've got 5 2.5 inch strips, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew them together. So I'll just line up the edges. And I'm not going to worry about pinning, but if you'd like to pin, you can pin. So now I'm just going to sew along the edge, and I'm still using my 1/4 inch foot. I'm stitching at stitch length 2, and I'm not worrying about back stitching. And when I don't use pins, I just make sure that I line up the edges and I correct it as I sew. So I'll just trim that thread, and now I'm just going to press in between sewing every strip on. So I'll set the seams, I'll go all the way along, open it up, finger press going up. Then we'll sew on our next strip. Now we sewed these 2 together starting at the top here, and just to reduce warping we're going to start at the bottom this time. So I'm going to flip it around, and we want to attach the next piece, making sure it's facing the right way if it is directional. So I'm just going to have to flip that around so I can see that my gingerbread men and my soldiers are facing the right way. And then I'll just line up those edges and sew and press again. Then I'll spin it around and sew the next strip on, and repeat that until I've sewn all the strips together. So I've sewn my 5 rows together, and I've pressed all the seams up one way, and now we're going to cut them into 2.5 inch strips. Now, depending on how many fabrics you use and if you want to fussy cut them, that means when you're cutting your 2.5 strips, you're sort of placing the ruler to get a particular image in it. Like I want these little soldiers. You might use more or less, so you're probably going to need to make up 2 pieces like this to get around your whole quilt top. So just see how you go. So I'll just start with a nice straight edge, cutting off all the salvages. And then I'll turn it around. And because I want to cut mine at 2.5 inches, and it means one of the soldiers is going to be right on the edge and one has got a lot of space. This is what I meant by fussy cutting. I'm actually going to move in a bit and then come back and trim a bit off this end. You might not have fabric that has images like this, so it's not going to be a problem. But I'll just show you what I will do. So now there's about the same on either side. So I'll just take a slither off this side. and then a slither off this side. So I've got about the same amount of space on either side of my little soldiers. So now what I need you to do is cut all of the sewn together strips into 2.5 inch strips. And then what we'll do is we'll sew them together. So now I've cut all my 2.5 inch strips, I'm going to sew them together, and because I am using directional fabric, I'm going to make sure that I'm sewing them in the right direction. So this one will go on here. I'll just flip it over, line up all the edges, including the corners, and if you'd like you can pin. Again, using my 1/4 inch foot, I'm not worrying about a back stitch, and I'm going to stitch at stitch length 2. Just trim my thread and trim the other side while I'm here. And then I'll do that until I've sewn all my strips together, and I'll press that seam up facing upwards like all the others, and I'll repeat until I've sewn them all together, and we'll end up with one really long strip like we did when we did our first border. So now we've got our really long 2.5 inch strip, and we're going to do exactly what we did before, but we're going to do something slightly different. So we're going to do the top and the bottom and then the sides. But what I'm going to do is measure how long I need it. And then instead of cutting roughly, I'm going to cut it, well, not cut it, I'm actually going to unpick it. So that looks about right to me. So what I'll do is I'm actually going to unpick these stitches so that it sits perfectly on my quilt. And I'm not sure if this is a conventional technique. Sometimes I just make this stuff up because it seems to make a lot of sense to me. Certainly seems easier than counting how many squares to sew together. So I'll just unpick that. You could give that a press if you'd like. And now we've got our first strip. Then I'll do my second one. So for my second one, because my fabric's directional, I want it to be going as if it's running around my quilt. So I'm going to have the top with my soldiers facing this way, and then I'm going to do the bottom with my soldiers facing this way. So I'll just take that into account and remember that when I'm sewing it. Okay, and then I'll unpick those stitches. Okay, so now I'll probably give those two ends just a quick press so they're sitting really nicely. I'll pin them and sew them just like I did the first borders, and then I'm going to do exactly the same for the side borders. And if you don't have enough of your strip, you will need to make a little bit more. So now I've finished attaching my borders. Now if yours don't match up perfectly at the end so that you've got the whole square lined up, it's fine to just cut it. And then one more thing I would just like to note is that when I attach my borders onto the quilt top, I just made sure that I was sewing down the seams to how I'd press them, and then that way it's going to sit really nicely. Okay, so now we've finished our Christmas tree quilt tops. What I suggest you do now is give all the loose threads a trim, including the ones that may have come through on the top. Give it a good press, and then it's time to baste it, quilt it, and bind it. You can find videos on how to do that in the link below, and I'll put some above as well. And if you've enjoyed my quilt top tutorial, please make sure you subscribe and hit the bell button so you get notifications every time I do a new video. Thank you. Thank you for watching my videos. If you're enjoying them, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment.